don't see China as an adversary, but there are challenging aspects to China's behavior that we see here in Europe and in the US as well. We recognize as well that European countries individually and even the US on its own cannot confront China and confront that behavior individually. So the more we can work together and cooperate together, the better. There are areas where we can see for cooperation with China, for example, on discussions on arms control, on climate change. But at the same time, we have to recognize that China is beginning to come closer to us, whether it's in terms of cyber attacks, whether it's in terms of investment in some of our critical infrastructure.
Right.
And we need to see how we can address some of those challenges. And I think it's very useful for us to...
Are they threats or challenges to NATO from China?
For the time being, we'd say they're challenges because they're challenges that we face, and I think we can face them all the better if we can work closely with partners such as New Zealand, Australia, Japan, and the Republic of Korea, where we have common interests around some of those challenges.
Is NATO aware of the risks to New Zealand here, though? Because if we align ourselves with NATO, China is our biggest trade partner. There's a real balancing act here for New Zealand.
Yeah, we recognise that, and for a lot of European nations, Germany, for example, China is also a huge trading partner. So, as I was saying, we don't see China as an adversary, but we have to look at some of the aspects of Chinese behaviour to see how we can address that and address those challenges.
When you say aspects of Chinese behaviour, when you say aspects of Chinese behaviour, can you give me an example, please?
Yeah, for example, whether it's cyber attacks that we've seen in the past, or whether it's some of the internal aspects that we see, so the crushing of democracy in Hong Kong, the increasingly rhetorical threats against Taiwan, the challenges that you can see in the South China Sea. So these are issues that we're concerned about and we want to discuss with regional partners. How could New Zealand play a part in that? What could New Zealand do? Well, I think, firstly, we'd be very, very interested to hear New Zealand's assessment of the regional challenges as you see them. Your perspective is different from that of Australia, for example, and again, different from Japan and Korea. All of these assessments, all of these views, it'll be interesting for all the allies based in Europe and North America to hear some of these views and these assessments. I mean, NATO is a European organisation, and obviously you have a crisis on the doorstep and New Zealanders feel for Ukrainians, but why should our Prime Minister get involved with a military alliance in Europe? Well, firstly, we're not a military alliance, we're a political military alliance, and effectively we work politically. Secondly, it's not just Europe, it's Europe and North America, so the United States and Canada. As I was saying earlier, we're beginning to look at things more globally anyway, and I think that the war in Ukraine is an example of where countries such as NATO countries, but also New Zealand, Australia, Japan, Korea, can come together around some shared values and some common values. New Zealand has been supporting Ukraine in the current conflict. They've been helping with providing equipment to Ukraine. There's also been New Zealand help with airlifting some of that equipment into Ukraine. This has been a substantial help to Ukraine, and I think it's an indication of where New Zealand sees its interests in terms of this war and this invasion by Russia. Do you want more help from New Zealand? And in return, what would New Zealand get by attending the summit? Well, I mean, firstly, there's no bargain going on here, but I think it'll be a discussion around shared values and common interests that we have together with countries such as New Zealand. One of the key outcomes that we're looking for from this summit is to increase the level of support from Ukraine. For Ukraine. If New Zealand is willing and able to help with that, I think that'll be very welcome to Ukraine, but to the rest of NATO as well. OK. If New Zealand sort of, becomes more aligned with NATO, would there be pressure on New Zealand to increase its defence spending to about 2% of GDP? At the moment, it's 1.5%. 2% seems to be the sort of standard for NATO member states. This is, 2% is the guideline for NATO member states, and all member states made a commitment back in 2014 to increase their levels of defence spending up to that level. Now it's increasingly being seen as a floor of spending rather than an upper level, and there are countries that are spending now above 2% of GDP. But this only applies to NATO members, and it's a political agreement within the alliance. It doesn't apply to partners. And partners such as New Zealand, they will have their own defence priorities. They will also have their own fiscal and government priorities. So there will be it's not for NATO to impose on New Zealand or any other country what they spend their money on and how they spend it.
You talk about how NATO, which originally was Europe focus, is now taking a more global focus. Does that mean that NATO wants to expand to sort of become a NATO plus? And is that why Pacific partners are being invited to the summit?
I think in terms of membership, no. I mean, NATO will stay focused around the European continent and North America. But yes, we do want to develop closer partnerships with countries around the globe. So countries such as New Zealand and Australia, which, as I said, they've been developing for the last 10, 20 years anyhow. We have partnerships with countries in the Middle East and North Africa, in the Arabian Gulf. Now in Latin America, we have a partnership with Colombia. So where we see shared values and shared interests, this is where we want to develop the partnerships so that we can, as an organisation with partners, better address some of the global challenges that we face.
Right. So should our Prime Minister expect an invitation to join the alliance on some greater level than the current partnership level?
Certainly not joining NATO, as New Zealand is. It's an Asian country. It's not an Asia-Pacific country. It's not a European country. But I think we will look for ways in discussion with New Zealand as to how we can further develop the partnership.
Would New Zealand's current nuclear-free stance present a problem for NATO if there was a development of relationship with NATO?
No, once again, this is New Zealand's sovereign right to choose its nuclear policy. And if it's not a member of NATO, then that's entirely within its remit. So it can choose any policy it wants on nuclear weapons.
OK, so obviously tensions are on a knife edge in Europe. If any NATO member is attacked, I mean, all the NATO members are obliged to defend the others. So therefore, should the world be prepared to see a war between NATO and Russia?
We've tried very, very hard to make sure that there is no escalation on the European continent. It's been very difficult. We have been working hard to support Ukraine. Indeed, since 2014, we've been supporting Ukraine with levels of assistance to help them defend their sovereignty. Since February this year, we've been providing far more in terms of lethal and non-lethal equipment, and NATO allies have really stepped up to provide the support that Ukraine needs. At the same time, we've also been very careful not to get NATO nations directly involved ourselves. So we have no NATO troops on the ground. And we've been very clear that, for example, we're not going to impose a no-fly zone, which would ultimately mean that a NATO country might have to shoot down a Russian plane. So we have set clear limits. We're also very clear that we will do everything that we can to defend all our allies. This is why we've stepped up our military presence in the east of our alliance to make sure there's a clear defensive message to Moscow that we will defend all our allies if there's any attack on any of those allies.
If Russia were to attack a NATO country and spark a conflict, and New Zealand has an increased kind of partnership with NATO, what would you expect from New Zealand?
Well, I mean, there would be no obligations on New Zealand whatsoever. But I think New Zealand has demonstrated in its partnership with NATO its support for Ukraine, for example, and where we have those common values and those common interests. And I think that it would not be for us to expect anything from New Zealand, but I would imagine that New Zealand would do what it can to support NATO allies.
New Zealand has a very small military. Is New Zealand of any worth to NATO at all?
New Zealand has a small but very effective military, as demonstrated by, for example, its deployment in Afghanistan with NATO. And also a very effective navy. And here we've worked very closely with New Zealand, for example, on maritime security issues. So every country, countries like New Zealand always have something to offer in terms of what we can learn and what they can contribute to NATO operations and missions.
Piers, I wonder, by including Asia-Pacific countries to the summit, Japan, South Korea, Australia and New Zealand, as you mentioned, is there a risk, or are you contributing to the setup of a sort of a new Cold War?
We certainly don't see it that way. It's more just a question of the partners, the countries with whom we have shared values and common interests, and having discussions with those countries. I think we are seeing increasingly the rise of authoritarian countries such as China and Russia. And the countries who don't share those values need to be able to stick together and work together to make sure that we can protect our values.
Just finally, this is a landmark summit for NATO. It's setting its agenda for the next decade, and NATO is releasing its new strategic concept at the summit. What's going to be in that?
Well, this is still being negotiated as we speak, so it'll be difficult for me to go into too much detail. But it's important to note that it's a document that we negotiate about once every 10 years. And I think if you look back 10 years ago, to our last strategic concept, Russia was described as a strategic partner. Now that is clearly no longer the case. And China was not mentioned in the strategic concept at all. So China will be mentioned this time. There will be discussion of that.
And finally, I guess NATO will be hoping to address the question, is there hope for peace in Ukraine and Russia conflict?
Indeed, and I mean this is something that we've been working on for many months. For the time being, our focus is very much on making sure that Ukraine is strengthened on the battlefield, because ultimately this will strengthen their position at the negotiating table. What's really critical and important is that the sovereignty and independence of Ukraine, a country in the heart of Europe, can be defended.
NATO Deputy Spokesperson Piers Cazalet, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much.
And there you have it, NATO Deputy Spokesperson Piers Cazalet. Now, if you have a news tip or a story idea, whakapāmai, get in touch with us.
We're on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram, or you can email us at nation@tv3.co.nz.
E whai ake nei, we dissect the week's political news with our panel, Georgina Stilianu, Tania Tapsell and Finn Hogan.
Plus, David Parker with revelations that some of our genetic modification rules are up for review.
We received an anonymous tip that 2 children were being held by a witch.
She is getting us ready for the baking.
I'm too young to be a strudel.
We might have a problem here, sir.
There's trouble in the hood. Time for a code read. Read Riding Hood, that is.
Who are you?
I'm your worst nightmare.
But not all fairy tales play by the book.
I got your happy ending right here.